Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. My name is Matthew Monagle. I'm the CRM Web Manager here at Columbia Business School Executive Education. And thank you for joining us for today's webinar on emotional intelligence for executives. Just a few pieces of business before we get started. We are going to make a full recording of this webinar available in about 3 to 5 business days. So I know that's usually the first thing people want to know. If you have to step out halfway through, if you have to leave a little early, don't worry, you'll get the full recording. You also can ask any questions you might have by using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Just leave a question in the Q&A section. We'll circle around back to it at the end. We're going to save about 5 minutes for questions at the very end. So to introduce today's guest, our guest today is Kevin Ochsner. He's a professor in the Department of Psychology here at Columbia University. He's also the director of the Social, Cognitive, and Affective Neuroscience Lab. And for our purposes today, he is one of the faculty that will be teaching in the upcoming Leveraging Neuroscience to Power Organization and Individual Performance, an executive education course running from June 13th to June 15th. Some of the content he's going to be sharing today is, well, he actually described it as an amuse-bouche, kind of a sneak preview of what he will be talking about on the first day of that program. But I'll let him get into a little bit more of the details and kind of give you a feeling for what his research covers. So, Kevin, welcome.
Thank you very much. So it's my pleasure to give you this appetizer, if you will, of things that will be covered in the executive education session in June. And I look forward to your questions at the end. So today what we're going to talk about is emotion. And any of you who have experienced the birth of a child, the death of a loved one, fallen in love, or experienced myriad other small or large emotional events in our daily lives know how important it is, how essential a piece of the fabric of our lives emotions are. Now, this is, of course, apparent to people beyond psychologists. So artists, for example, like Pablo Picasso, wrote that the artist is a receptacle for the emotions that come from all over the place, from the sky, from the earth, from a scrap of paper, from a passing shape, from a spider's web. The idea there is that emotions can be elicited by myriad events, small and large. And the question is, what do they inspire us to do? How do they inspire us to act, think, feel, perceive, and remember? Of course, clinicians know about the power of emotion as well. Turns out that emotion dysregulation lies at the heart of virtually every type of mood and anxiety disorder and is at the core of substance abuse disorders as well. Social psychologists have attempted to measure the extent to which emotion is a key aspect of the meaning of events in our daily lives. So in a classic book from the 1960s by Charles Osgood, they had a number of people assess the extent to which all kinds of things in their lives mattered to them along all manner of dimensions. What they found, doing fancy statistical analyses, was that at the end of the day, 2/3 of the meaning we ascribe to things that happen to us, the actions we engage in, the events that we experience, is whether something is positive or negative. And whether things are positive or negative is the core of emotional responding. And what I'll do in a very brief manner today, and in more detail in the executive education session in June, is talk about how emotion is the hub or the core for the way in which we think and act. We'll talk about the way emotion is related to our beliefs, how our beliefs determine the nature of our emotions, and in turn, how our emotions influence the nature of our beliefs. How what we attend to and perceive is importantly colored and shaped by our affective or emotional responses. How what we remember is influenced by emotion as well. How in turn our judgments that we make or decisions that we make are importantly infused with emotion. And then finally, we'll talk about the way in which emotion and your ability to exert self-control, or in fact help control the behavior or regulate the behavior of other people, is importantly all about emotion. And I'll symbolize what aspect or which one of these 5 core domains of function we're talking about in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. So let me just begin by talking about what do we mean when we say emotion. So we talk about emotion, we're referring to the way in which a stimulus or an event, it could be a comment someone's made, it could be feedback you got on a report, it could be, if you're a New Yorker like I am, the feeling you have when a taxi almost runs over the person in front of you as they're stepping off the curb. You then appraise or interpret the meaning of that event to your current goals, your wants, and your needs, and that generates an emotional response. That includes changes in certainly how you feel, what your experience is like, but it also changes whether your heart is accelerating or decelerating. Is it pounding hard when the cab almost hits you, or is it slowing down when you're experiencing a quiet, restful moment? That also leads to changes in facial expression and body language as well. Now, just to give you a concrete example to nail this down, imagine that you're engaging in public speaking. Now, for many people, the key way of appraising the meaning of a presentation is it going to come across well? What are other people's responses to it going to be? Psychologists would call this an ambiguous threat. You don't know whether or not it's going to be received well. You don't know what their evaluation of you might be, and this produces the emotion of anxiety. On the other hand, if you're experiencing the irrevocable loss, for example, when you've experienced the death of a loved one, but this could be the loss of a job, the loss of a promotion, the loss of an opportunity for having a good performance evaluation. It could be any kind of loss that's irrevocable. That appraisal of the meaning of the event produces sadness. And in fact, there are different patterns of appraisal that produce various different kinds of emotional response. Now, it turns out that these appraisals happen very, very rapidly, typically on the order of fractions of a second. They're based in part on evolutionarily learned patterns of interpreting the meaning of the world, but we also learn them throughout our lifespan, and there's a whole set of brain regions that are really important for it. I just want to introduce you to them to give you a flavor of how complicated emotion is underneath the hood, if you will. So here you're looking at a picture of a person's head as viewed from the right-hand side. Their skull is transparent, so you can see their brain. And it's just, for illustrative purposes, illuminated as if it was orange. Now, here's that same person's head as viewed from the front, looking down from above. And there are directions in the brain that are going to be important to know, so when I refer to a brain region, you'll know what I'm talking about. This is sort of like knowing north, south, east, and west for a map. So first, there's the left side and the right side of the brain. Now, you note that when the person is looking directly at you, the right side of their brain is on your left, and the left side of their brain is on your right. We've helpfully colored the two sides of the brain, the two hemispheres, if you will, to distinguish them. When we talk about lateral parts of the brain, that's towards the outside, closer to your ears. When we talk about medial parts of the brain, they're right there on the middle, or the midline of your brain. And then finally, when we talk about dorsal parts of your brain, those are towards the top of your head. And ventral parts of the brain are towards the bottom, its bottom, which is closer to your chin. Now, this is important because one of the absolutely essential regions of the brain is here, illustrated by this black oval, and it's known as ventromedial or orbitofrontal cortex. So ventral for the bottom, medial for the middle, and orbitofrontal because it lies behind the orbital bone that's above your eye. Your eyebrows are right on top of your orbital ridge. And I'm illustrating it here in a different view with this red oval. That's as if you could see somebody's left hemisphere of their brain taking the right off completely and looking right at the medial portion of that ventral part of their frontal lobe. You might also want to know that the lobes of your brain are named for the bones of the skull under which they lie. Another key part of the brain, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex there is important for encoding what things mean in a given context. So for example, that offhand comment that somebody made, is that important right now? In this context, maybe it is, because they're trying to send me a signal that I should change my behavior. Another part of the brain that's important is called the insula. This is a view of the right hemisphere, as if you've taken off part of your frontal lobe when you're looking in. The insula receives ascending information about your body. It knows what your heart's doing, what your lungs are doing, whether your blood pressure's high or low, and those body states are a key part of your emotional response. Now let's look through your head as if it was transparent again, but now you look at the outer surface of the brain, and it's the cortex. That means bark in Greek. The Greeks named parts of your brain for the things in the world that they physically resembled. And there are two subcortical structures here that are important. One is the amygdala. That means almond in Greek. It's important for detecting. It's the early warning system. Hey, there's something really relevant to me. It's relevant to my goals. It's going to trigger an emotion. I should attend to it and remember it. And there's another brain region right next to it known as ventral or bottom striatum. It would look striped. That's all striatum means. It's important for encoding what thoughts, actions, or stimuli or events have led to good outcomes for you in your life. So that's a quick whistle-stop tour of these brain regions, but let me give you a flavor for what they actually do in your everyday behavior. So we're often faced with the question when we meet someone for the first time, or we're having a conversation, a meeting, and so on, what are they feeling? Knowing what they're feeling is a key indicator of how they're evaluating you, the content of what you're saying, and so on. Shown here are two facial expressions. Now, if you look at the one on the left, you might say, this person is probably afraid. And it turns out there's a singular brain system that's critical for this. It's the amygdala. If you were to damage the amygdala, you would be unable to recognize when other people are expressing fear. It turns out that one of the rules of the way the brain works is that the systems that are important for you triggering a particular kind of emotion are important for perceiving that emotion in other people. If you lesion the amygdala, you can't learn to fear things either. In fact, you would go around life in a relatively fearless state, which, although that sounds good, it turns out not to always be good, because fear is a signal that there's a potential danger there. And other people's facial expressions of fear also tell you there's a potential threat around. Otherwise, why would they look afraid? So the amygdala detects that, says, hey, look around the world and let me know what's going on. And this can happen even if you're unaware of the fact that you've detected that facial expression or any other cue to threat. It happens just a fraction of a second, just a few milliseconds or thousandths of a second. The facial expression on the right is a disgust expression. Turns out your insula is incredibly important for that. Disgust is about telling you that your body's been contaminated in some way. And if you lesion the insula, which receives this bodily information, you cannot recognize that expression of disgust. And likewise, you don't experience disgust. Again, it's this rule. Brain systems for experiencing the emotion yourself are useful for perceiving it in other people. Now, what about things like attraction or other more subtle types of social cues? It turns out that brain regions like the ventral striatum, they've learned what's rewarding, what you'd want to approach, what might be good for you. They tend to tell you, well, you've learned that these kinds of facial expressions are these kinds of individuals are attractive, and they motivate you unconsciously to start moving towards cues that you've learned to associate with reward, including individuals who might be attractive. And they create, in fact, a kind of halo effect when you judge such people. We tend to judge them as possessing all kinds of other positive traits simply because you find them attractive. And the ventral striatum is particularly important for that. Let me give you another example when you're forming a first impression of a person. There's some wonderful research done by the late social neuroscientist Nalini Ambady and her student Nicholas Rule, where they showed the faces of CEOs of the top and bottom 25 Fortune 500 companies as of 2006, including the face of Rex Tillerson, who was then and still is the CEO of ExxonMobil. And they also did a similar experiment with the top managing partners of the top 100 law firms. They had you rate behaviorally a whole bunch of different traits. How competent, dominant do these people seem? How mature do they look? Again, this is just from their face. How trustworthy and how likable do they seem? Psychologists boil these down to power and warmth as two key dimensions. And then you might ask, what such quick first impressions made on the basis of seeing a face, even for a second or 500 milliseconds, it's half a second, what do they predict? Well, it turns out that it predicts the profits of these companies and their profit margin over and above their expenses. And it turns out there's a brain region I've already told you about that's responsible for this. It's in fact the amygdala. The amygdala's activity when you're looking at an image of these CEOs, this was done just for the CEOs, predicts the profits that these companies have. So what does this tell you? What this suggests is that the brain is quickly making assessments, forming first impressions of individuals in such a way that it must influence the way lots of people respond to them in the context of their company in a way that trickles down to predict the profits of that company. This is a highly provocative finding that we'll talk about again in just a second. Let me give you another example of how we need to go beyond first impressions, however, and how the brain helps us do that. So if I show you this facial expression, it looks like this guy is what? Smiling. Well, if you take into account the context and you ask, why is he doing it? It turns out he's trying to sell you something. And we're very good at going beyond the face, going beyond the information that's provided just by the smile, the frown, the twitch of an eyebrow, or even whether someone looks particularly competent and warm, or attractive or unattractive. When we do that, We go beyond the brain systems I've shown you on the left. Those are the systems that provide your quick initial first pass, your initial signal that something's relevant to your goals, and they start to motivate your behavior towards them, to trust or not trust someone, to like or not like someone. And there's a whole set of other brain systems that we will talk about in detail in June that are important for what we call mentalizing. This is thinking at a higher level about why people are doing what they're doing. Or in other words, what are their intentions? What do they want from me? Why are they smiling? Why are they frowning? What are their general tendencies and traits? Are they like this in general for everyone? Is this just for me? We need to be able to do this strategically for a number of reasons in business contexts, and there's a system of the brain dedicated to it. It's so important. Let me give you one final example here. So, and this is in the context of how emotion influences your judgment. So I'm showing you here again this portion of your ventromedial or orbitofrontal cortex, highlighted here now by the yellow oval. That's what where it would be if you were viewing it from the right side of someone's head and could look right through their skull. Now, let me show you what it looks like from the underside of your brain. So if you're looking in the direction of that arrow, the center of the screen now shows your orbitofrontal cortex highlighted in red. And now let me show you what it would look like in your skull. Where does your orbitofrontal cortex sit? Now, the view from above is indicated by the arrow-marked skull view. Now, if you notice, this is the image on the right. If you notice at its top, it looks like there's these little bony ridges. Those bony ridges are important because when you get a closed head injury, so for example, if you're in a car accident, you bang your head on the windshield, or if you happen to trip and fall and bang your head, or if you're a skateboarder or a bicyclist not wearing a helmet and you bang your skull against something, or even if you are wearing a helmet, what happens is your skull stops when it hits the hard object, but your brain keeps moving. And in fact, it ricochets back and forth inside your skull, bang, 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 hitting the front of your skull, the back of your skull until it stops. Now, those bony ridges under your orbital frontal cortex are really important because they act like a washboard grading the cheese-like substance of your brain. It damages your orbital frontal cortex selectively. Now, damage to orbital frontal cortex is very important for emotion because this is the region that puts in context the behaviors that you can engage in and the behaviors of other people. You might have an impulse to make a particular kind of comment to someone, compliment them on, say, their appearance. But you know, in this business context, that's not appropriate. I shouldn't be doing that. If you're in a bar, it might be a different manner. But in this business context, you have to be very aware of the context appropriateness of behaviors. And it turns out when you have damage to orbital frontal cortex, that is exactly what goes away. And for a long time, this was not appreciated. In fact, damage to orbital frontal cortex and the loss, people would often lose their jobs. They'd lose their spouses because they didn't act appropriately. You'd lose your sense of humor. You'd start acting funny. And in fact, there's a very famous individual in the neuroscience literature who had damage to this brain region known as Phineas Gage. After damage to this part of his brain, he made lewd, inappropriate comments to women. He would make strange comments to his colleagues. People would say he's no longer Gage, no longer Phineas Gage. And we didn't really understand why this was the case for quite a long time until about 15 to 20 years ago. The psychologists, Antonio Damasio, or the neuroscientists, I should say, Antonio Damasio and Antoine Bechara, came up with a clever task to capture a key aspect of what this brain region's doing. They created what they called the Iowa gambling task because they were at the University of Iowa at the time. So here you have two people depicted playing this game. One is a control subject on the left. They're typically developing average person like all of us. The person on the right has damage to that orbital frontal, that ventromedial portion of their brain. Now in this game, you have a deck of cards in front of you, so actually you have 4 decks of cards. They're only showing 2 here. Let me illustrate all 4 here. Well, for today's purposes, we'll just call them decks A, B, C, and D. Decks A and B, over time, if you kept making selections, these cards are all face down. When you pick them up and look at them, you win some money and you lose some money. The bad decks are kind of the ones that sucker you in. It's like playing a game in Las Vegas where every now and then you get a really big payoff and it makes you think, wow, I could really win a lot of money. But over time, you end up losing money. For every 10 cards you select, you lose $250. That's the net loss per 10 cards. Now, the good decks, on the other hand, are slow and steady. They're like the tortoise in the old story. You only win a little bit of money every time, but over time it adds up. You might have a loss here and there, but slow and steady wins the race. You keep picking from them, you're going to win out. If you're a typically developing person, you figure this out. You intuit. I know kind of it's safe to go with the good decks, and you end up winning money. It takes you about 30 to 40 selections from a deck of 100 cards to figure this out, but you get it. Orbital frontal cortex has learned, hey, my body, my feelings are telling me intuitively I should pick from the good decks and avoid the bad decks. If you've got damage to orbital frontal cortex, however, as illustrated by these brain images of damage where the colors reflect damage to the patients who were studied by Damasio and colleagues, you tend to keep picking from the bad decks. You never learn that, hey, even though there's this subtle, or even though you get an occasional large reward, over time it's just bad to keep making these choices. And what they found was that the patients who perform badly on this task might be a stockbroker and be unable to realize what are the good stocks and the bad stocks. We tend to think we rationally think through these kinds of options, but it turns out actually that it's your emotion systems that are learning to tag what's a good choice and what's a bad choice, and they're implicitly guiding our choices. This is why people tend to get divorced, why they tend to lose their spouses, their girlfriends, their husbands, and so on, when they get damaged to this region. They no longer act appropriately. Their emotions are no longer in tune with the social context. So the last example I want to give you, and then I'll stop, comes from the way in which emotions influence judgment as well. This is a very cute example that's timely because we're in a presidential election year. So Alex Todorov, who's at Princeton, did a study back in 2005 where they showed people the candidates from Senate races from states where they didn't know who the candidates were. So here are examples from the Wisconsin Senate race in 2004. And they'd simply ask you to rate how competent each person feels, or seems to be. Sometimes they'd ask you to make a rating for one person. Sometimes they'd say, which of these two people seems more confident or competent? And it turns out it doesn't matter how much time you give them to do this. You could give them a fraction of a second or 5 seconds. You get exactly the same predictive power. It turns out it predicts the votes these people actually receive 66 to 73% of the time. Now you might ask, okay, what brain region predicts this? They did a separate brain imaging study. They replicated the findings, the people in the sample of participants they ran in a brain imaging study. Their judgments of competence could predict the election winners above chance. And it turns out the brain region we talked about earlier is important for disgust. The insula is absolutely critical for this. It's almost as if your insula is implicitly giving you a signal from your body that, this one guy doesn't seem so good, this other one does. And it's a strong predictor of whether or not you actually end up, which people end up winning the election. So I hope that's given you a flavor for what we'll be talking about in June, and given you some food for thought that will inspire some questions. One thing we will be talking about in June, I just want to mention, that's critically important, is now that you would learn how emotion can influence various aspects of your beliefs, perception, memory, and judgment, how can you have emotion, how can you take control over your emotion? How can you understand the way in which there's a bi-directional relationship? Now that you know how emotion can influence you, how do you take control of that? But that's something we're going to go into detail in June. So I'll stop there and take questions.
Kevin, thank you so much. That's really great information. And I know that because there's so much in there, the big question I've seen is, will we have a recording of this? I'm going to lead off by saying, yes, we are going to post this recording to our webinar archive in about 3 to 5 business days. So be sure to take some time, go back in, look over some of that information again, and really internalize it, and then follow up with us if you have any questions. But for the questions that are more general that you'll want to answer, one of the big ones that came up was how leadership development programs, how organizations, how coaching certification programs can better incorporate emotional intelligence into what they're already teaching. Do you have some maybe quick guides or quick advice to people that are leading their own HR departments and want to fold this in a bit to what they're already doing?
Sure. I think the first thing to let people know is emotion is the core for virtually all behavior. It provides the motivational impulse for people to pick one course of action for a company or another. It's at the core of evaluating people, judging their competence. Without us even knowing, our emotions are influencing our judgments of people, and even though we aren't aware of the fact that that's happening. One of the goals that we have is sort of guided by the motto, knowledge is power. And so if you make people aware of that, the next question is, okay, now that we know that that's happening all the time, how do you make people more aware of the fact that they're having emotional reactions and then take the next step to taking control of them? Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to go into that today, but if you come in June, we'll be able to talk about that in more detail.
And kind of along those lines as well, some people were wondering if you've seen companies or organizations that are doing a better job of identifying leaders based on their ability to target and manage emotional intelligence. Is this something that you've seen kind of adopted in the mainstream in a lot of business leadership, or is this still something that there's a great opportunity for people to bring them into their own orgs?
Well, I think it really depends. So there is a company out there known as the Neuro Leadership Institute, which champions the use of neuroscience to inform leaders and HR folks in various kinds of contexts. And in collaboration with this group, I was speaking to Microsoft at their global leadership event just 4 days ago, where I was talking about a lot of this information. I know that some other companies like American Express are interested in this kind of thing. They are trying to take advantage of these principles. I know a lot of individual personal coaches and HR folks are interested. And I think there's a growing realization that this kind of information can be really powerful because on the one hand, it can empower an individual to take control over a situation. On the other hand, knowing the brain basis for this empowers them to try to convince other people, like, look, this really is happening. This is happening in your brain, and here's how it's happening. And that knowledge, I think, arms people to be even more convincing when they're trying to present to their corporations the reason to change their behavior in some way.
Now, one question that came up that I liked, are you able, is there any easy way to incorporate some of this knowledge into the interview and application process, considering you'll have a limited amount of time and the first time you're actually face-to-face with someone might be during that interview? Is there any good way for people to incorporate this when they're looking at new hires?
Yeah, that's one of the critical questions, isn't it? So, yes, there is, for sure. One of the key things to know is that our emotion systems are a source of all kinds of non-conscious and implicit bias, where we can be biased by negative evaluations we might have of others on the basis of gender, ethnicity or race, and age. And it turns out that brain system I talked about, the amygdala, and in its interactions with your orbitofrontal cortex, are largely responsible for this. They might be shifting and shaping our evaluations of people on the basis of dimensions that are irrelevant to their actual competence. And that often happens at the first stage of the interview process, or even a second stage. There's this phenomenon in psychology that's been studied where you might try to have a very diverse set of candidates you consider, but then when it comes down to picking one of them, you often pick against diversity. And it turns out that in groups, having more diverse people from diverse backgrounds and diverse interests actually makes the group decision-making more intelligent and smarter over time. So I'd say that's the first thing to know about, is that these brain systems are going to implicitly be a source of bias against certain kinds of individuals.
And then one final question. I know there's a lot of people who've expressed interest in participating in the program, and that's great to see. But if there are people who cannot come to Columbia and join the Neuro Leadership program, is there any recommended reading or any good starting places for them to kind of begin the process of looking at this on their own?
Sure. Two things. One is if you're interested in delving into the kind of hard science of it, the website for my lab, which will actually be completely revamped in about a week, has the core science for a lot of these things. Another place you can go is that there's a number of articles that have been written in the Harvard Business Review, I believe it's called, that take into account some of these neuroscience principles. If you go also to the website of, I think, the Neuro Leadership Institute, they have a number of articles that they write in collaboration with scientists like myself. I've done some with them. There are other scientists like me that have done them, where they have a number of articles that try to take insights from neuroscience and apply them directly to the business community.
Kevin, that's really great information. Thank you so much for all your time today. To everyone who participated in the webinar, we thank you for your questions. We're sorry for the ones we weren't able to get to, but we will be sending out an email to everyone who's registered for this webinar that contains not only the link to the webinar, but also more information about the neuroscience program. So if you are interested in attending, or if you'd just like to learn a little bit more information about our speaker today and some of the other content provided, be sure to keep an eye out for that email. Kevin, thank you so much, and we'll look forward to talking to you again in June.
Thank you.